So welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing the rural brain drain. I'm Pat Zerke, director of Cambridge Forum. Thousands of small communities in the heartland of America are being depopulated as the brightest and most ambitious of their young people abandon farms and small towns for the challenges and rewards of cities. In 2001, with funding from the MacArthur Foundation, our speaker Patrick Carr and his wife Maria Kafalas moved to Iowa to investigate the phenomenon they call hollowing out. What happens to communities left behind when the next generation leaves for college and careers? What does this depopulation mean for the rest of the United States and for our national identity? Patrick Carr is Associate Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University. Among his earlier books is Clean Streets, a study of grassroots activism in a Chicago community. His latest book, co-authored with his wife, also a sociologist, Maria Kafalas, is Hollowing Out the Middle, the Rural Brain Drain and What It Means for America. This book serves as the basis for our discussion. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Patrick Carr.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you to the Cambridge Forum for inviting me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be here at an event that's been going on for 43 years, and hopefully after tonight I won't kill it, so that's my goal, one of my goals. I also want to thank the people from Beacon Press who believed in this book when few others did, and several of them are here in the house tonight. Gayatri, our editor, Pam, our wonderful publicist, and Joanna, who has also helped us enormously. So tonight I want to talk about what's going on in small town America, specifically what my wife and I call the hollowing out of many small towns dotted across the American heartland, which we believe has severe repercussions for the country as a whole. The most dramatic evidence of this rural meltdown has been the latest manifestation of the brain drain, that is, losing the most talented young people at precisely the same time that changes in farming and industry have transformed the landscape for those who stay. The brain drain isn't a new phenomenon, and we certainly didn't discover it, but by the 21st century, the shortage of young people in small towns has reached, we believe, a tipping point, and its consequences are more severe now than they have been before. Simply put, many small towns are years away from extinction, while others limp along in a weakened and debilitated state. To give you an idea of the scale of this issue, consider the following. In just over 2 decades, more than 700 rural counties, from the plains to the Texas Panhandle through Appalachia, lost 10% or more of their population. Nationally, there are more deaths than births in 1 out of 2 rural counties. And though the hollowing out process feeds off the current recession, the problem predates and indeed, we think, presaged many of the nation's current economic woes. The symbolic significance of small towns is very powerful and very resonant, yet the very real rural crisis that assuages the heartland is barely visible. Moreover, we think this crisis perennially takes a backseat to the more visible big city woes. And while there is a veritable academic industry devoted to chronicling urban decline, the small town struggles have been largely off the grid. And yet, upon close inspection, the rural and urban downturns have much in common, even though our conventional wisdom casts the small town as the embodiment of all that is right with America, and the inner city as all that is wrong with it. The noted Harvard sociologist and the best boss that I ever had, William Julius Wilson, famously describes how deindustrialization, joblessness, middle-class flight, depopulation, and global market shifts gave rise to the urban hypoghettos of the 1970s. And these same forces, in their most recent manifestation, are now afflicting the nation's countryside. The differences are just in the details. In urban centers, young men with NBA replica jerseys sling dime bags from vacant buildings, while in small towns, drug dealers wearing NASCAR t-shirts and living in trailer parks sell and use meth. Young girls in the countryside who become mothers before finishing high school share stories of lost adolescence and despair that differ little from the ones their urban sisters might tell. In both settings, there is no shortage of guns, although in North Philadelphia's Badlands or Chicago's South Side, those guns are more likely illegal, while in small towns, guns hang on display in polished oak cabinets. But despite the seriousness of the hollowing out process, we believe that, with a plan and a vision, many small towns can arrest this spiral of decline and play a key role in the nation's recovery. Why does hollowing out matter? Surely, there have always been regional winners and losers. Richard Florida's very influential book, The Rise of the Creative Class, celebrates how modern-day boomtowns prospered when the young and the educated flocked to cities like Austin, Chicago, San Francisco in search of good jobs, culture, diversity, and tolerance during the 1990s. But the incipient decline of the Rust and Corn Belts illustrates the darker side of the creative class story, the fates of the people and the places that are left behind. But if this is just the latest version of the boom and bust cycle of frontier towns, why not just let it take its course? As one set of commentators have said, why not let the plains revert to a Buffalo Commons? We believe that it would be a mistake to abandon the region because hollowing out has repercussions far beyond the boundaries of the small towns it affects. The health of the heartland is vital to the country as a whole because we believe this is the place where most of our food comes from. It can be ground zero for the green economy and for sustainable agriculture. It is also the place that helps elect our presidents. Who would doubt the centrality of the win in Iowa for Barack Obama's election? And it sends more than its fair share of young men and women to fight and die for this country. So as we came to uncover this slow-burning crisis during our research in Iowa, we learned that hollowing out results from a combination of macro forces reshaping non-metropolitan America, such as the unfettered rise of agribusiness and big box retailing, which has suffocated local ownership, the decline of unions and blue-collar wages, employers' increased reliance on exploited, undocumented workers, and the systematic underinvestment in younger workers entering the new economy's labor force without college degrees. For instance, the rise of agribusiness has meant that there are hardly any farmers left in America's agricultural regions. Just 2% of Americans operate farms now, and over 42% of Midwestern farmers earn less than $20,000 a year. For generations, the Corn Belt's biggest employers were factories where building Deere tractors and Maytag washers sustained the region and made it possible for workers on the line to become middle class. But in an old familiar story, automation and outsourcing has dried up the demand for labor and diminished wages. Deindustrialization came later to the countryside than it did to the city, but it has caused just as much harm. These larger economic trends are just part of the story, though, and it was not until we spent time living in a typical small town in Iowa and interviewed young adults who came of age there that we came to understand how small towns collude in their own demise. As was stated in the intro, in 2001, with support from the MacArthur Foundation's Network on Transitions to Adulthood, a multidisciplinary research collaborative, we moved to the pseudonymous Ellis, an Iowa town, population of 2,000, pretty typical farm and factory town in the northeastern corner of the state. Just as husband and wife sociologists Robert and Helen Lind had traveled to Muncie, Indiana, to chronicle how the 20th century industrial era was transforming the lives of small-town America in their Middletown series, we took our family then to Ellis to document how 21st century Iowans were trying to survive in a post-industrialized global era. Our year and a half spent interviewing the more than 200 people who had attended the town's high school in the late 1980s and early 1990s led us to characterize our young Iowans according to the defining traits of where their lives had taken them by their 20s and 30s. We found quite early on that young people in a small town are faced with two major life-defining questions when they come of age. Do you stay or do you go? And if you go, do you ever come back? We found that the largest group, approximately 40%, consisted of what we call the working class stayers, those who never leave, who were struggling in the region's dying agro-industrial economy. About 1 in 5 became the college-bound achievers, who often left for good. Just 10% of those we talked to included the seekers, who were not on the college track and who joined the military to see what the world beyond their small town offers. And the rest were what we call the returners, people who eventually circled back to their hometowns, only a very small number of whom were professionals we call high flyers. What surprised us most was that the adults in the community were playing a pivotal part in the town's decline by overinvesting, cultivating and pushing the best and brightest young people to leave, and by underinvesting in those who stay, even though it is the latter who are the town's best chance for a future. The paradox was summed up for us very early on in our time in Ellis by a local high school's guidance counsellor, who informed us that, quote, the best kids go while the ones with the biggest problems stay, and then we have to deal with their kids in the schools in the next generation. These, quote, best kids are the high-achieving, most likely to succeed students destined for college, as I said, what we call the achievers, while the ones with the biggest problems, the stayers, get trapped in the region's fading economy. So as achievers are pushed, prodded and cultivated to leave and credit their teachers with being integral to their success, the stayers view school as an alienating experience and zoom into the labour force the first chance they get, mainly because few people are invested in keeping them on a post-secondary track, and the lure of a regular paycheck is hard to resist. Seekers, like the stayers, receive few of the resources and cultivations that achievers do, and they satisfy their desire to leave by joining the military. For some, this means that they'll never come back, while others do, but usually without the skills and credentials that would make their lives appreciably better. Most returners are similar in profile to the stayers, the main difference being that they spend some time away, although this is always usually meant to be a temporary arrangement. These returners are most often community college graduates who end up in pink-collar occupations and who marry stayers when they settle back home. High flyers, that small group of returners who are professionals and entrepreneurs, are achievers who come back, and while they are the group most sought after by small towns and the objects of state and local programs from Maine to Louisiana, they are few, far between, and more likely to be motivated to move by personal reasons than by any incentives that are dreamed up in attempts to lure them. At first glance, teachers, parents, and kids, stayers, achievers, seekers, and returners, seem comfortable with this arrangement. Schools devote their energies to the most serious and committed students, and young people who are adrift get focus and maturity, not to mention money, from joining the workforce. Yet it is that compromise which makes so much sense during the high school years that ultimately comes back to betray the community and its young people. In a post-industrial economy that places such a high premium on credentials and has ever less demand for workers with just a high school diploma, the choices these stayers make doom them to downward mobility and poverty. Seekers mistakenly believe that the service can equip them with the skills and education that will benefit them when they are discharged, but many find that they are woefully underprepared when they do so. And most returners are like the stayers, except for their brief sojourn away. It is when you combine what happens at the level of the small town with the wider forces that have fundamentally transformed the economy in rural America that the depth and severity of hollowing out is apparent. So given that these communities are hemorrhaging young people, investing most of their energy in developing those who will end up elsewhere makes little sense. And underinvesting in those who stay and many who return is also self-defeating, because we do live in a time when sustaining blue-collar jobs are practically non-existent, and the need for skills that are prized in a post-industrial economy has never been greater. So what can be done to plug this brain drain? Though the problem is daunting, we believe that it is not intractable, but that any set of solutions must combine changes at micro and macro levels. First, small towns need to equalize their investments across different groups of young people. While it would be impractical and downright wrong to abort students' ambitions, there must be a radical rethinking of the goals of a high school education. The single-minded focus on pushing the most motivated students into four-year colleges must be balanced by efforts to match young people not headed for bachelor's degrees with training, vocational, and assorted associate's degree programs. Those programs fill the needs of a post-industrial economy, but acknowledge that not every student wants to or will pursue a more traditional college path. Also, school officials, parents, educators, and students must resist the temptation to think the non-college band will just get a job if a degree is not in the cards. Gone are the days of plentiful, well-paying blue-collar factory jobs that provided a 19-year-old with a living wage, and thinking that working the line at John Deere or Winnebago will vault you into the middle class makes about as much sense as buying 8-track tapes in the iPod age. All the planning and investments have been geared to college-bound students, while the reality is that students not earning a college degree need as much, if not more, intensive preparation for today's labour market. The next step is to build better links between high school and post-secondary education, and to map existing opportunities onto regional economic goals. Most of the job growth, for example, within Iowa is expected to come from computer, biotech, wind energy, and healthcare. Matching high school students not headed for university with vocational or community college programs, nurturing their interests while in high school through internships and training, will prepare them for the new economic growth areas. Such partnerships require close collaborations among business and civic leaders, elected officials, and secondary and community college administrators who are not accustomed to working outside of their own bureaucracies. Moreover, the growing distance learning technology should not cater only to older returning students. If students are interested in wind technology or nursing, rather than making them take social studies in their senior year of high school, how about connecting them with a distance learning class at Iowa Lakes Community College in Introduction to Computers? Third, small towns should seek to embrace immigration wherever possible. A difficult sell at the best of times. The phenomenon of Hispanic boomtowns, a common occurrence in the Midwest, has the potential to transform moribund local economies. Such transformations will only be possible if there's careful planning to ensure that immigrants are integrated into the community in such a way as to increase contact between natives and immigrants, and with attendant labor law reform that curbs abuses and ensures sufficient wages and benefits for workers in agribusiness and manufacturing. PhDs from India or China or Central and South America should be encouraged, along with less skilled immigrants, to be recruited in an effort to make the Heartland an immigrant enterprise zone. The region is in critical need of professional class workers, especially medical workers, and bringing in Hispanic workers just for the food industry will not be sufficient. Fourth, areas that are losing population can help remain vibrant by enticing much-needed high flyers to come back home. There are free land programs in Kansas, Minnesota, and North Dakota, a statewide campaign in Iowa to bring back professionals, and student loan forgiveness programs in Maine and West Virginia for college graduates committing to stay in the state. While the jury is out on whether any of these programs work, we believe that towns can help themselves by identifying future professionals prospectively and offering them tuition relief for graduate school that is contingent upon a 10-year commitment to practice in the area. Many rural areas, in fact, over half of all rural counties have one or more medically underserved areas, and this is one way to tackle that very basic problem. At a more macro level, there is much that can be done, and ironically, the current economic crisis provides perhaps an unrivaled opportunity to do it. First, the economic stimulus provides much-needed investment that can help kickstart efforts to rebuild regional economies, but it must be accompanied by changes that will provide a more fundamental makeover. Specifically, there is ample scope for developing so-called green economy initiatives in wind and solar power. Already, for instance, the shuttered Maytag plant in Newton, Iowa, has been refitted to produce wind turbines. Workers will need to be retrained to staff these nascent industries, and again, community colleges can be pivotal in fulfilling that role. Alongside the green economy, we should rethink how we produce food in America. Michael Pollan, for example, has argued persuasively that now is the time to produce incentives for polycultural farming that will diversify the food produced in the Corn Belt, reduce the use of artificial fertilizers, and increase the availability of organic and locally grown meat and produce. Though it is a daunting prospect to try and loosen the agribusiness stranglehold, reinventing the food industry offers the chance to bring people back onto the land. Alongside those efforts should be reforms allowing agricultural workers to organize and curbing the all too prevalent labor abuses that contribute to the long-term fragility of rural economies. To that end, national immigration policy should also be reformed away from the costly and often counterproductive interdiction efforts towards ones that offer long-time undocumented workers a pathway to citizenship and encourages a more complete participation of immigrants in their home communities. A third area for national action is in the reshaping of post-secondary education to better meet the challenges of globalization in the post-industrial economy. Based on the experiences of the stayers and many of the returners we spoke with, we see a need to provide training in fields and specialties most sought after. And community colleges will again be key in that regard. Already, President Obama has recognized the crucial role community colleges can play when in July he introduced the American Graduation Initiative, which will commit over $12 billion in funding to provide scholarships for students, modernize colleges, and build links with other schools and businesses. Ultimately, with a plan and a vision, the undoing of Middle America is not preordained. The rural crisis has been ignored for far too long, but we believe it isn't too late to start paying attention. The residents of rural America must embrace the fact that to survive, the world they knew and cherished must change, and that on a national level, rural development must be more closely linked to national economic growth priorities, and policies must be created to help these communities prepare for a future that is already here. Thank you.
You've talked a lot about what the brain drain means for the small towns in the middle of the country, in the heartland. What does it mean for the rest of America, for the cities that are gaining population, for the booming South and the West?
Well, it's good for them. It's funny, when we were writing this book, we were asked this question, why does this matter? And because we're social scientists, we, of course, said, well, we're going to have to poll a few people. So we, started calling on people in Iowa, people we knew, and said, the people at Beacon want to know why this matters. And, people were apoplectic. Well, how can you even have, of course it matters. And, so the responses range from, well, a country is like a body, and that it can only function when all of its organs are working, and that to have an America where your heartland isn't working, is counterproductive. To allow it to occur and to atrophy even further would be tantamount, one person said, to letting the South secede, during the Civil War. And then other people spoke about the very real things that the sort of heartland can contribute, and again focusing on the fact that most of the food that we eat is produced there, and that it can be ground zero for changes in how we produce food, and for polycultural farming, and for green economy initiatives, which by their very nature really can be, and most often work better when they're decentralized. So there's a lot that can happen, and to sort of simply let small towns die probably isn't an option. We believe, and we agree with our Iowa poll, that it's worth keeping.
When you listed some of the possible solutions for this problem, it struck me that there seems to be almost a paradoxical or contradiction. The kinds of changes that you're proposing, immigration, investment in community colleges, seem to be almost unthinkable for the people who are staying in these small towns. And how do you bridge that gap?
I think I'd bracket those out. I take them one at a time. So okay. Let's take immigration first. Immigration is the one issue that provokes perhaps the most heated response from people, when we say, you need to embrace immigration and immigrants in all of its forms, not just, the sort of, low-wage agricultural Hispanic migratory labor force, but also in terms of professionals and so on. And some places have done this very successfully and have integrated well, but have done so because they've planned it. It is a difficult sell, but our goal in sort of setting that out is one of the things we would like small towns to think about is fairly simple. The economic transformative power of an influx of immigrants is without a doubt it's one of the things that is, you can take it to the bank, that will transform your local economy. But it's what happens afterwards that creates problems in terms of it often is accompanied by ghettoization of the immigrant population. It's often accompanied by other social problems, and then you have situations like you have in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, where the mayor unilaterally declares that nobody can employ illegal immigrants, that any stores that serve illegal immigrants can be, they can have their licenses revoked and so on. So you have this kind of reactionary backlash, which is one of the sort of extremes that can happen. But our point in doing this is to open up the conversation that this is one way you can very quickly build your local economy. But again, we peg it to changes that we believe will benefit everybody. So a lot of the resentment for stayers towards immigrants accrues from the fact that when Hispanic immigrants came into the meatpacking industry and came into agribusiness, wages pretty much became a third of what they were 10, 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that was because agribusiness knew that they could exploit an undocumented labor force, and they could then pay them $6.20 an hour, whereas natives were getting paid $18 an hour in 1990. And so, you associate the movement of these workers with, well, that's when my job became a crappy job. And that's true. So one of the things we're very careful to, as I said, to peg to immigration is fundamental changes in labor law that allow workers in agribusiness to organize and to advocate for better wages. And the counter argument from agribusiness is, well, we'll just move away. Well, they won't, because the fact of the matter is their raw materials are there, and they need to be in the Midwest, and they need to be in these small towns in Storm Lake and so on, Postville. So they're not going to move. And I think national reforms that allow workers to advocate for not only just better wages, but better working conditions. I mean, one of the plants in Postville, Iowa, had 157 labor safety violations in an 18-month period, which to me is staggering. And that's, on the more extreme end of things, but these are some of the things. So you have these workers who have been paid nothing, who are working in very, very dangerous conditions. And if you change that, I think that would help change the perception, because again, you wouldn't be associating immigrant populations with your declining paycheck and so on. The second point, which is also a very good point, but one about the community colleges, the stayers and many of the returners spoke very eloquently to us about it. And I remember these are guys who came of age in the late 80s and early 90s. And we heard this refrain. There was one guy, put it, I think, most succinctly when he said, look, I wish I'd had a course in high school where I learned about computers, for example, because this is where this economy is going. He was a sort of an unskilled manual worker. He'd work in construction. He'd work, in agribusiness, and, he'd get laid off periodically. And he said, look, I need those skills. And if I'd had access to those kinds of things, or if I could retrain, or if there were ways in which I could get those kinds of abilities and credentials and even just the basic skills, then I'd be much more able to sort of diversify myself in the modern economy. So we heard that from people. So I think, again, it's not just a matter of reforming what the community colleges do, but linking that into what is done at the high school level, because I think there's a huge disconnect. The only programs that high school seniors can take in Iowa and also in Minnesota for credit are courses that will sort of allow them to accrue enough community colleges credits to transfer into university for a 4-year degree. And that's great for those who want to do that, but there has to be other ways of, for those who don't want to go on and no interest and maybe not the abilities to go on to a 4-year college program, you have to provide other sort of linkages, and I think they're not there, and they could be there quite easily.
So are these communities on their own to figure this out?
Right now they are, and that's the sense we get from people. I mean, one of the things that's been very striking has been the response that the book and various sort of little pieces that we've written, we get emails from the Chamber of Commerce in Newton, Iowa, or a group in North Carolina, or somebody in South Dakota who kind of say, well, we're trying to figure this out ourselves. And very early on in our research, one of the things that kind of helped us sort of figure out the larger issue here that we wrote about, the Rotary in this town of Ellis said, we'd like you to come to our Wednesday meeting and talk about your research. We said, oh yeah, we'd love to do that. He said, yeah, because we're trying to figure out how we can get doctors and lawyers and people with professional degrees to come back. And we were like, well, that's going to be very difficult, because you do such a good job in greasing the rails for them to leave that pulling them back is very, very difficult. So I think towns do feel that they're on their own, but I think, again, one of the things that we would see as a way forward is, again, using the sort of regional economies, and again, sort of thinking in regional terms, not just in sort of small town or even county terms, that, something that's going to develop a region and something that's a coordinated plan. And Dick Longworth, who's written an awesome book that came out before us called Caught in the Middle about globalization in the Midwest, talks about that, talks about developing regional economies in the Midwest as one of the ways to offset the damage that globalization has done.
My wife and I live in Cambridge, and you've done a wonderful job describing the pieces of the puzzle. And I've been involved in research and why squatters move to the central cities, and I work for Boston, which benefits from Richard Florida's creative class. But we also have a place in Maine. And one part that has fascinated me is how in these communities, first UPS, the fax, email, there are a lot of changes going on that are equalizers. They don't reverse the tilt, but for example, the people who are not able to be here tonight could be sitting in Iowa and getting this if someone points them in the right direction. If I miss an important column in the New York Times or something on PBS, I'm able to go and get it directly off the internet. And I have the feeling that years ago, first the railroads came, then the roads, and people were not on the roads. But there are equalizers that could be used. And I'm very aware, for example, artists tend to move almost where life is less expensive. And interesting, the gays in Boston go to the poor areas, the rough areas. And so there are quite a few opportunities which, if integrated with some of the new incentives you're talking about, can change things. Although I agree, it's a formidable task.
Absolutely. That's a great point. One of the things we talk about in the book that I didn't touch on tonight, but I wanted now because I think you've brought it up very nicely, is that a lot of what states have done individually, and I'm talking about Michigan, Iowa, Maine, West Virginia, to a lesser extent Louisiana, is to focus on, and Michigan in particular really sort of has bought in wholesale to the creative class idea. And for a very simple reason that the state of Michigan has, two massive state universities and several smaller ones that produce tens of thousands of qualified graduates a year, and less than 7% of the technology graduates, so those who are coming out in computer sciences and engineering and so on, stay in the state. So they hemorrhage 93% of their technology graduates. And so their thinking was kind of along the lines here, is that we have these equalizers, the internet and so on, and if we sort of create what they called cool cities, and it was called the Cool City Initiative, again, along the creative class idea, if every city becomes a cool city, then people will stay, right? So if they have the Wi-Fi and the latte and the, open mic night for their singer-songwriters and so on, right? That it'll be the magical silver bullet that'll make everybody stay. Well, it actually hasn't worked out that way. And part of it is very simply that you can only go so far with that stuff. So, the fact that there are sort of Wi-Fi bald patches in, half an hour east of Des Moines, for example, really frustrates the people in Iowa, because they say, how can we get these people to come back when they can't get their Wi-Fi or their 3G going or whatever it is? So it's fine. It's really the sort of Field of Dreams idea. If you build it, they're going to come. But they kind of don't. And what we found was the high flyers, those professionals who come back, as I said in the talk, they come back for very personal reasons. And not always because, let's be honest, if you have a choice between Ottumwa and Aspen, you're going to move to Aspen. Because it's just, you can have a bike trail in Ottumwa and you can hike all until you're blue in the face, but you're not in the Rocky Mountains with the, beautiful Aspen backdrop and so on, right? So I see what you're saying, and I think it's very important. You absolutely have to have a baseline of amenities to make it livable. But if you put all of your development eggs in that basket, it's a mistake, because, as I said, Michigan bought hook, line, and sinker into creative class, and it just hasn't worked out.
So I'm an example of your brain drain from rural areas. I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and I was a salutatorian in my high school class. But after I graduated from college, I left there and never went back. And lived on the East Coast here for quite a number of years. But I was really quite surprised in your list of suggestions that they were mostly what I would call supply side suggestions, education, training, accommodations to immigration, things like that. And I know for myself and other of my contemporaries, the biggest reason why we left is there was no good jobs. Right. So, I mean, I would think that, and I know many states and cities have tried, but, attracting the right kinds of jobs that would incent people to stay seems like, if you don't do that, then all the supply side kinds of things if you train the people with the junior colleges or the high school courses, they're just going to go where the jobs are that they've just now become able to achieve, able to get to. So, I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
No, you're absolutely right. No, I mean, and that's something we're very keenly aware of, and let me respond to that in two ways. One, there are jobs, and that's one of the well, there are good jobs. I mean, there are good jobs. There are labor shortages in key areas in Iowa. As I talked about the labor shortages in health and nursing and biotech. There are increasing numbers of jobs in the so-called green economy, and again, part of what's wrong right now is that the people who are there aren't ready for those jobs, and part of it is getting them the skills that when those jobs are available, and they are, and that's one of the reasons that the state of Iowa and other states are trying desperately to attract people to come back is that we need people, who are nurses, we need people who are doctors. We have, in the state of Iowa, 167 medically underserved areas. And again, concentrated very much in the non-metropolitan counties and so on. So, you have seniors who are in their 70s who are driving 2 hours to see a doctor or a dentist. That's an area that, not just for the doctor or dentist, but for the hygienist and the assistant and so on, right? That there are lots of ways to sort of, again, map the opportunities and connect them with the people who don't have the skills, but giving them the skills and so on. So you're absolutely right, but I wouldn't say that there are no jobs. I think part of what has to happen is you do need to develop opportunities, but you also need to be able to avail of the opportunities that are already there. And so there are some that are there. You need to develop additional ones. And as I said, I do believe that some of the changes that we've advocated for are ones that if they're not as labor intensive as, say, polycultural farming isn't as labor intensive as farming was 50 or 60 years ago, but it is something that can bring people back onto the land. And I think increasingly, as we get honest with ourselves, we're all going to want to eat grass-fed beef and, drink, local microbrew beers and so on. These are not bad things. These are probably good for our health in the long run. I think we're moving very slowly towards that, and the success of, some of the larger, organic dairy operations, for example, show that you can actually make money from this stuff. So, we think that the only way to produce food is a hog hotel. It's really not. I think, if the incentives are there and the willingness to make those changes, you can bring a lot of people back, onto the land. You can also, again, develop those green economy initiatives I talked about that, again, they need labor. They need people with skills. And there's no point having a town full of people who don't have the skills and sort of, putting an ad out and having people come from California who have those skills when you have people right there who could easily take those jobs. So you're absolutely right, but I think, it's one thing we do. We talk more about it in the book than I did tonight, so.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Nelbandian, and I am a supporter of the forum. I'd like to ask, does this same situation exist in Europe? And if so, how are the Europeans dealing with it?
That's a great question. Yes, and they're dealing with it better than we are. And speaking as European, I can say, yeah, way for Europe. I'm a off the boat Mick. So I'm from a town called Drogheda, which is a dirty industrial town between Dublin and Belfast. So, and I'm part of the Drogheda brain drain. I drained myself out. So. And Drogheda's been debilitated ever since. But there's always been migration away from towns, and there's always been a brain drain. It's not, again, we didn't discover this. What's different in Europe, there are several things that are different in Europe. Small towns are more, I think, viable, particularly in mainland Europe, than they are here, mainly because of how they produce food, and mainly because of how people shop. They buy stuff differently than we do, and they produce food differently than we do. So, for example, you can be in a small little town in Provence, and the cheese that you're going to buy is made by Michel down the road, right? And the carrots that you're going to, make into a soup, are Jean Henry's or whatever. There is this kind of immediacy of the food production. It's much more decentralized. There isn't, certainly in large part in most of mainland Europe, agribusiness isn't as hegemonic as it is here in America. And then people they buy food differently. They buy food every day. So you buy it fresh, you cook it fresh, and so on. So that's part of, even when you have this brain drain, you also have this kind of very labor intensive, very immediate food production cycle that, has both sort of bolstered these local economies and sort of made them much more vibrant in, as these kind of little ink spots, that they're not dependent on, having a manufacturing plant. And that's the other thing that, one of the reasons that the hollowing out is so debilitating here is because in a lot of our Midwestern towns, alongside sort of agriculture and the changes in agriculture, you have the changes in industry. And they disproportionately affect, again, these small towns, because if your fortunes are pegged to one plant and that one plant closes or, decides to eliminate a shift or whatever it is, or depresses wages because they say, listen, guys, globalization can't pay you $15 an hour anymore. We're going to pay you $8. Oh, and your benefits are gone too. That's a massive body blow. But on the plus side of it, Newton I was an example of what can happen. I mean, they lost Maytag, and when they lost Maytag, people said they're done, right? They're just stick a fork in that town, that's finished, because Maytag was that town. But they said, okay, well, we've got to fix this, so they refitted the place, retrained the workforce, and they don't employ as many producing the wind turbines as they did making the Maytag washers, but still they've managed to sort of, keep the town sort of afloat. So those are some of the differences. It's a great question, though, between Europe and here.
You mentioned a lot about economics, and you also mentioned about this idea of the cool city to try to attract people. In your research, did you get deeper into the fundamental reason that people live in these towns and embracing, what their real reason for being there for so long? And if some of those towns try to describe that and make it an attractive reason why people would come or people would stay?
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. One of the first questions in the research was, why do you live where you live, and what is it about the place that you live that you like, right? And for the stairs, it was amazing. The people who left have this very ambivalent, and I don't know if you feel the same way still, I loved growing up there, that we would hear, and it's a great place to raise kids, and it's a wonderful, I can leave my bike out and my door is always open and so on. But there just was something drawing me away, and I wanted to be somewhere that was more diverse, and I wanted to experience other things, and I wanted opportunities. But there's this, deep-seated ambivalence about the decision to leave. For the stairs were very succinct. It was a very strange question for them when we asked them the same question. So what is it about Ellis that, you like? And they were like, well, it's where I was born, it's where I'm going to die. It's like the John Mellencamp song, right? That I was born in a small town, I'm going to die in a small town, and so on. And that really, was the extent of their ability to sort of to think about that. But when we went a little deeper in some of the narratives, when people started to explain a little bit more about what that meant, it really was just this fierce attachment to this. It's a dot on the landscape, right? This small town it's got no stoplights, it's got just the one sort of gas station and so on, and it's just sort of out there on the plains. But there is this kind of fierce sort of loyalty to it. So to answer the second part of your question, the state of Iowa's sort of bring back the professional, or what Tom Vilsack, who's now the Secretary of Agriculture, called the Come Back to Iowa Please campaign, focuses on exactly those things that you're talking about. That, look, hey, we're the 6th safest state in the nation, whatever that means, right? We're the, what was the other, there was a couple of other taglines that we're the 6th safest state in the nation. We're the 8th cheapest place to buy land or something like that. Basically you can come back here and raise a family on a farmstead and so on. And they had these advertisements where they had these, high flyers who would come back. And there was one guy who was he had worked in real estate in California. And so, and they talked about it in this way. Here's a man who knows about where to live, because of his profession, and he's chosen Iowa. And he talks, and the little sort of blurb about him says, he gave up his 1,100 square feet for like a 4.5 acre place that cost him half as much, and this, this idea that you can sort of have your piece of America, raise your family in safety, and it's good, right? But the issue then becomes, if that's the only thing you're offering, you're really sort of, you're chancing your arm in a way that, if it's just like, well, here, there's lots of land, hey, you won't get killed in your bed. Oh, there's no traffic, that's right, yeah, where commutes can be measured in, that's the other tagline I couldn't think of, where commutes can be measured in minutes instead of hours. And it's very true. For the whole time I was there and the time since that I've driven around that state, I've never been in a traffic jam, which is freaky. It is very freaky. And also living there, one of the things that, and I've always lived in a city or, big town or a city, the first couple of nights just living out in the plains, I couldn't sleep because it was so quiet. It was just freaking me out. I just like, and I, what was that? What was that? What was that? It's nothing. There's just nothing. There's no noise. There's no sirens. Nothing. So, but it's a very good point. You have a question, so.
Did you look into the zoning laws? They're absolutely fundamentally different. The Europeans can keep a town together in ways that we cannot. Our zoning laws basically come from the Northwest Ordinance. The towns are too small to do a damn thing to protect themselves. You want a zoning permit in France, you want one in England, there's only one place you can go. Here, you go across the town line and put up Walmart across the town line and suck everything out. They don't allow it. And it involves the role of government, and government is, we'd rather destroy the country than take a look and see what we could do by looking at what other countries are doing.
No, you're absolutely right. But again, this is not a comparative piece, so I'm just speaking extemporaneously about Europe, because I have an EU passport. But I will say, one counterexample of that is, and my friend and compatriot here, Jim, will back me up on this, the zoning laws in Ireland are practically non-existent. If you have enough money, you can put up houses and or shopping centres anywhere you want, and they've pretty much ruined the countryside because of that. So Ireland's mimicked America in lots of ways. So, but I think you're right. I think
we've got 3 states. Could you use the microphone so we can? We've got 3 states that allow zoning by counties. We've got some counties that look just exactly like Europe. They're in those areas because you have a much bigger zoning area, and you can't do the same things.
Right. No, absolutely right.
You mentioned the high flyers and that being a very small percentage of the total population. I'm interested in just a question as a subset of those high flyers. Did you find many people who were from small towns left, but then came back, not to the same towns, but went back to rural America, just other places, whether for some affinity of that small town life or something? I have a friend who is from rural Kansas and just recently graduated college and is now in small town rural Colorado because she felt drawn to that life. And so it's personal reasons or personal beliefs there also, but it's not the same as just going back to the town where you grew up.
No, absolutely. And we did. The short answer is yes, we did. And again, the strange thing is, the one thing that's most striking about that is it is purely for those very personal reasons. And that all of the incentives and all of the sort of state programs kind of believe that, well, if we give you a tax write-off on your student loans, or if we build a bike path, you'll move back. But really, it's almost something that you can't legislate for, because it is something that's entirely personal, and that it's something that can happen to you at different stages of your life. In your 20s, you could think, well, I want to be living in a city, and then just suddenly say, I think I need to move back, to the kind of place, maybe not that place, but we did find that, yes.
I live in a very small town, but probably not one you would think of studying. I actually live in Kauai. And the whole island is tiny. It's only about 60,000 people. It's very rural farming. And I'm considering draining myself out of there. I'm just actually visiting here now, one of the places I think I might move to, because, and I was very glad that you mentioned this, of the situation with farming, that I can't get good food there. And you would think that being, where I live, where there's a year-round growing season, our vegetables are pathetic and horrible, and we just don't have the people there who can make money in farming. And I think until that problem can be addressed, I can't see how you're really going to solve the problem in the rest of rural America.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think we have to be committed to it, and we also have to, I think, believe that it is possible to make money from smaller units. I mean, we've been, I think, duped by agribusiness thinking, well, it has to be a mega farm, or mega farms are the only things that can make money. And, economists have sort of argued with us, said, oh, agriculture is doing fine. Agriculture is turning a profit. And we said, well, no, agriculture is not turning a profit. Big agriculture is turning a profit. And, they're also sort of forcing others to compete with them on an uneven playing field, because kind of, how many, pounds of pig can you produce? How many, bushels of corn can you produce, per acre, and so on. And this kind of move towards sort of like, this single crop farming, this monocultural farming that, is bad for the land and is bad for the food and is reliant completely on artificial fertilizers. And, so all of those things that when you move away from that, it is possible, to have good food that tastes good and good beer that tastes good and, wine. I mean, why not? You could grow grapes in Iowa. Why not?
Well, it's kind of ironic and I think, frankly, pathetic at this point that in our country, if you want good food, you can't get it from where we have the best soil, really, in the middle of the country. Yeah. You have to go to a place like San Francisco or New York City or Boston. And when I say good food, I mean in the true food snob sense. I'm totally in line with Michael Pollan, where I believe if you want to eat well, you have to have something that's grass-fed or produced by a person. I don't think agribusiness really produces food. I'm not sure you should call it that.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's kind of funny that now it seems to be okay that it's companies doing the collectivizing rather than the government. Anyway, what the part I was kind of interested in is you sort of hear things, and as somebody who's, we all have our prejudices, and, maybe I grew up with a certain prejudice against people, from the more rural areas, sort of having the sense that people are kind of complicit in their own being pushed down. I mean, some of the areas you're talking about that kind of would need the most of an attitude shift, I'm sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, are the ones who seem to be, at least from our stereotype of it, to be sort of, the kind of people who watch, like, say, a certain television network, which shall be nameless, and sort of buying into that. Is that sort of a stereotype, maybe, of these areas from, like, say, the point of view of, like, an effete urban person like me?
Just so we're clear in our unspoken coastal elitism here.
Yeah.
We're talking about Fox News Channel. Is that what we're talking about? Or, yeah. I mean, I think a stereotype is just that. And Pat and I had this conversation beforehand, and she asked me a very good question that hope I'm not gazumping somebody else's question here, but about, so what are the implications in terms of political extremism? Because Tom Frank has written What's the Matter with Kansas, and it is. I mean, it's crazy. Why are these people voting completely against their own self-interest, right? Because, that's fairly easy to document. I will say this. We didn't find that level of conservatism as a sort of a coherent movement that was present in this town. Did we encounter it? Sure we did. I mean, it was, there were a couple of very awkward moments for us in the field. There was one, I remember we were at Mass in the Catholic Church, and I am what Richard Russo calls a collapsed Catholic, but, it was kind of part of the whole thing was immerse yourself and go to the various things. So we're there, and our 2-year-old daughter at the time was just been like a 2-year-old, and she was like, she had ants in her pants. And so we came for those of you who are not Catholic, towards the end of the Mass, before we received the Holy Host, we shake hands with each other in the sign of peace, and it's kind of a way to share germs and build fellowship and so on. The people around us didn't shake our hand. And it was, they were closer than we are. So it wasn't that we were too far away. And I was like, well, that just goes to show you. We've been recorded, so I can't say what I felt or express it with the language that I would normally use. And that was an extreme example, but again, sort of redolent of what a small town can be like. And so there's one of those things that's kind of, well, you're an outsider and you're not conforming to the mores of this place, and I'm not going to shake your hand. So I think, but I do think that's extreme. And one of the counter examples when we were chatting beforehand, which I think is a good one, is that Iowa voted for Barack Obama, and I don't think he'd be president if that didn't happen. I mean, I think that was just such a crucial. I don't think I'm overplaying. I mean, it was such a crucial development, because then people be, hey, this guy can get elected in Iowa, then there must be something to him, right? So I think we have to be aware that desperation can sometimes breed extremism, but I think we also need to be aware that that's not the inevitable outcome, and that there are other outcomes, and ones that are much more, for the want of a better term, Catholic, with a small c.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry. Hi. As a native Iowan, I would be remiss to not say something
Yay!
here. And I guess the first thing that I want to say, and maybe you'll have a response to this, I wouldn't call it a question though, is growing up in Iowa, I don't think anyone, whether they're a stayer or a high flyer or whatever, takes pride in the state itself or being from the state. And I was noting this a few days ago while watching a McDonald's commercial about what makes a New Englander a New Englander. And there's this egotism, no offense, that people from bigger cities or near metropolitan areas are able to have, because you feel like you're at the center of something, maybe the center of the world. Growing up in Iowa, you never, ever have the sense that the world revolves around you. That's just a point, or an aside. And I would be also remiss to say that you can get really good food in Iowa. There are some wonderful CSAs cropping up, and all of that agriculture, just like agriculture anywhere else in the United States, is outside of the mainstream. And it's supported by college communities or other metropolitan areas, but it exists. And that brings me to my kind of question, which is, have you investigated how the reformation of the U.S. Farm Bill would actually preserve or reinvigorate the small towns? Thank you.
That's a great question. Whereabouts in Iowa are you from?
Marion, Iowa, right near Cedar Rapids. I went to Grinnell College in Grinnell.
I interviewed somebody who had moved to Marion, actually. So I've been there, and many other places. Like, you're absolutely right in terms of the CSAs. And actually, in the college towns in Iowa City and Ames, to a lesser extent in Des Moines, there are many more restaurants now than when we started doing this in 2001 that advertise the fact that, all of our produce comes from local growers, all of our beef is grass-fed, and so on. So that is different. That is certainly different, and is hopeful, right? It's a hopeful thing. The Farm Bill. The bad news about the Farm Bill, and the thing that worries me about Tom Vilsack in particular, is Tom Vilsack, for all of his, and some of the things he did as governor of Iowa. I'm going to make Iowa the Ellis Island of the Midwest, and people said, "Oh, geez, Tom, we don't like that." Oh, you know what? What I said was I was going to make sure that lots of professionals come from overseas. Never, I'm going to have gay marriage. Oh, well, not gay marriage, no, and so on. So he's a flip-flopper of the highest order. The one thing he doesn't flip-flop on, which worries me greatly, is his support, unstinting support for agribusiness. He has a record of being not just in bed with these guys, I mean betrothed to these guys. So that worries me. The Farm Bill is completely lacking in any real substance with respect to, there's lip service paid to, shall we call it alternative agriculture or polycultural farming or whatever you want to call it, but there's no real substance to it. And I'm afraid that with him as Secretary of Agriculture, that's not going to change. Despite, and there is a groundswell, because, hey, Michael Pollan is now a household name, and for good reason. He's really advanced this agenda for us in ways that make a lot of sense. It's not just this pie in the sky stuff, but it's, this can work, and here's how it can work. So I think the change will probably come if the president decides that this is something he wants to pursue. There's been no indication of that. This is, again, one of the reasons for writing this book, for starting this conversation, is to try and push this as an issue, because it's really not right now. And I hope that, Vilsack, has his road to Damascus and gets struck by lightning or something, and then just... But only in a beneficial way, where he'd see the error of his ways and change what he thinks, but maybe not.
I'm Dan Likely, and I grew up in a small farm community, not in Iowa, but in Michigan, which is still doing well because it happened by geographical circumstances. It's close to the university, which means it's a boom place rather than a ghost town. Well, having driven back and forth across the country several times in the last couple of years, and get to Omaha and you can get 600 more miles of farms, or turn right 600 miles through the Dakotas going up, and there's just a vast array of farms, cornfields as far as your eye can see. And there's a small town every 10 miles. And historically, why was when those farms were started in the 1800s, that's as far as you could go in a day with your wagon to pick up your supplies and bring it back. So you needed, and half the people in the country lived on farms. So we needed all those villages and small towns like I grew up on to support the farm community. That's all it was when I grew up. But now with so few people living there, maybe you don't need all those small towns. There's so many of them, and they just may become ghost towns or obsolete. And they aren't just going to the coast. When I was out there, I noticed that Fargo and Sioux Falls are two of the fastest growing cities in America. Now the Sun Belt has slowed down. So the people in South Dakota and in North Dakota are moving, and not all the way to the coast. They're going to the cities. They're abandoning their small villages and farms because they want to be more concentrated. So how have you looked at that? Well, I'm not sure I gave a coherent question.
So if I understand it correctly, you're sort of saying, well, there's an inevitability about the decline and demise of some of these places. And that's probably true because, again, you do have boom and bust cycles and some places just kind of cease to exist. But on the scale that we're talking about, we're not just talking about some regional losers, We're talking about literally, hundreds and thousands of small towns.
Thousands of towns.
Right.
Yes.
I think it's a mistake because, again, I do think that there is more to the tale, particularly with respect to sort of opportunities. And I also think it's a mistake because of the let me just share with you, I mean, since this book has come out, we've been receiving emails unbid from all over the country, from people in these very places who are, say, oh, I'm so glad that you wrote this, and they might disagree with some of the things that we say or whatever else, and that's fine, that's healthy, but they want their places to survive, and
Yes,
they
they
believe
do.
in the future of their places, and I think for us to sort of say, well, let's just wash our hands and just say, well, you know what, just let nature have at it, I think is a mistake, because I do believe that we do need these places. I think they're part of what can be a vibrant.
They're aging, they're graying, the people there are
Sure.
getting older. And the key item is when they lose their school and you
That's
have
it.
to bus it to,
That's right.
then
Yeah.
it's the beginning of the end.
That's
and
what
I don't
we-
know how you stop that.
Yeah, and the town we were in, the town of Ellis, they amalgamated their school with a nearby town while we were there. So that was they didn't have enough kids to keep their high school open.
Yeah.
So that that's one of the death knells. It's like if you
Yes,
can't
it
keep your high
is.
school going, then you're in trouble. So you're absolutely right. But I do believe that there's.
There's a way to turn it all around.
I do. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be here.
Well, I hope you're right.
Yeah, I do too. Or else I'll have egg in my face, right?
Hello. I'm wondering if you could speak about any gender differences that you found.
Oh, simple question. Yes, there were. In terms of who left, the achievers, the college-bound kids, fairly equally distributed, maybe slightly more young women than young men, but fairly equally distributed. The seekers who joined the military, mostly men, but quite a few young women again, I would say in the region of 20%. Of the stayers are mostly male. And the sort of returners who end up marrying them are women. So the story we heard quite frequently was from the young women, we call them boomerangs because they kind of go away for a short period and they boomerang right back, right? I was always going to come back. I just wanted to be away for a while, or I went and I got my associates and I came back and I married my high school sweetheart or whatever it was, or the guy from the town that I knew, and so on. And those returners would continue to date these stayer men while they were away, and they'd sometimes be in suitcase schools where they'd be, not quite commuters, but they'd be back, for weekends and whatnot. So there were gender differences in terms of the high flyers that we had. Again, mostly women. Now, I'm not sure that that's going to be typical of every small town. It was of ours at that time. So professional women, doctors, dentists, coming back to work in these small towns. So, but there were gender differences.
I wanted to ask you about an issue that you mentioned at the macro level, but one of our questioners was bringing it up recently, and that's the whole issue of isolation. That seems to me, being from a small town and having left it and always knowing I wanted to leave it, swinging on the gate, I want to get out the gate, from the time I could walk to the gate. The internet is fine, but people want to go to Fargo. They seem to want to be with other people, and as these towns depopulate, you said they become even more isolated. You have to drive 2 hours to get to the doctor. Could you say a little bit more about the impact of isolation on this whole depopulation cycle?
Oh, it has a huge impact. I mean, one of the, there are two ways to kind of come back at that issue. Let me just talk about the response to the question and then I think the other response that sort of builds on that one. So first off, isolation is one of the things that drives people away, and not so much isolation as we talked before about the lack of opportunities, but also one of the things that the achievers, and to a lesser extent the seekers, talked about, as being a motivating force in their lives for wanting to go, was this, what we call a hankering for diversity. Like, I want to experience. One of the kids actually put it, he was an achiever, and he says, I went to college at Iowa, and I had black roommates, and I didn't know that they had all these things that they did with their hair, and I experienced all this, all this was just blew his mind, and he was delighted. And he says at the end of it, he says, I realized that not everybody's Lutheran. And and it was just one of those, kind of pithy sort of, quotes that sort of really, sort of underscored this, like the wide world just blew this kid's mind, and that he wanted this, and it sort of met his expectations because, he wanted to embrace this difference. And that was, very much a sort of a common theme in these narratives that they talked about. And then the flip side of it is that the stayers don't talk about that, and they don't seem to mind the isolation, that it's fine, it's actually nice, because for many of the stayers, when they talked about going to, maybe not even so much Iowa City, but maybe Waterloo, which is a city that's, a couple of hours away, but is sort of the nearest large city to them, and how troubling that was to them sometimes, because it was just so noisy and dirty, and really, Waterloo's not a dirty city at all. I mean, I live in Philadelphia, and I'd stack that up anytime. But it was just so very different and very, very much outside of what they wanted. This kind of quiet pastoral existence. Now, in terms of the sort of then the flip side of that is then, if you reduce isolation, does it flip over the brain drain? And I think it can't hurt. And I think, the internet's part of that, in the sense that, yes, you can be connected and having, Wi-Fi capability, and so on. These are all good things. But I think that you can't sort of recreate the experiences that this young man, who was, pseudonym as Jerry, talked about, the sort of the non-Lutheran world. You can't really sort of recreate that very easily. So I think a lot of the sort of responses to hollowing out are like, well, we need more amenities. And so if we have these amenities, then people will stay because we'll have those amenities, right? So we'll have the bike trail, and we'll have, the cafe that, has organic coffee and whatever else. And yes and no. So I think it's important to have those things. It's important to have different sort of things that will attract people and also benefit people who do stay. I mean, I don't think, organic coffee is not going to kill you. A grass-fed steak is not going to kill you. It might actually be good. An organic beer, certainly. It's funny, I was back in Ellis in August. A very good friend of mine was retiring, and he invited me to his retirement party. I said, oh, sure, I'll come back. And so, being the Irishman, of course, I was designated to be barman for the day because, let's just be, the Iowans love their, oh, you've got your stereotype, we're going to put you right in your little box. But no, I was delighted to be the barman for the day, but, I knew this was going to happen, so I said, I'm stopping off in Iowa City before I go up, and I'm making sure that I'm bringing some decent beer to this place, because what's going to end up is they're going to have a couple of cases of Busch Light in a big vat of ice, and that's going to be it. And I said, I'm not going to drink that stuff, So, I showed up with my back seat full of, Fat Tire and, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and whatever else fancy, liberal, East Coasty, elitist beer and West Coast elitist beer. And I was right, because there were 4 cases of Busch Light and then my 6-packs, which were drunk before the Busch Light. So I think I built up people's beer palates for them, but, so it's possible to do. It's probably not the answer you were looking for, but maybe more entertaining.
Well, liberal beer is non-isolating, I guess, is the lesson to take away. But I also wanted to ask you about scale, and a number of questions have alluded to the issue of scale, the scale of agribusiness versus small family farming, the scale of money to be made from big business, whether it's a big industry or agribusiness, and the kind of smaller factories that small towns can support. And the sense of well-being that people have when they're not at the very top of the economic ladder. And how does that play into the brain drain?
That's a great question. Let me answer that by giving you an example from the small town that I think in part answers it, but I think it opens out some of these possibilities. This town is dependent on, not really dependent on the land. Not many people work in agriculture. There are 2 factories that basically employ most of the town. And one of these factories builds emergency vehicles, which is very labor intensive, but also quite profitable because they're one of their claims to fame was when Dale Earnhardt was mortally injured at the Daytona Raceway, he was taken away in one of their ambulances, which everybody was saying, "Hey, one of our ambulances!" Oh, Dale Earnhardt. No NASCAR fans here, obviously. Coastal elitists. But no, so the story of this emergency vehicle plant is very interesting. They opened in Ellis 18 years ago. And about 9 or so years ago, a company wanted to buy them out and move the plant to Mexico. And the owner, who is not from Ellis, but is from a similar town in South Dakota, turned down the offer and for much less money sold it to the workers. So we actually lost money on it. And we talked to him and he was going to say, well, how crazy are you, madman? Turn your back on filthy lucre and selling it to the workers. And he said, well, it was the right thing to do. And I knew if I sold it to this company, it would be gone. And the town might not recover from that. Now, as it is, he also was very interesting to talk to because we spoke with him. We said, well, so what do you think about the future? He said, well, I worry. I worry because, it just takes one downturn for, us to, not be able to keep going or to eliminate a shift or whatever. And, we're surviving right now, but what we need to do is grow. And I thought that was, again, a very good way of encapsulating, the difficulties that these small towns have, particularly when you hit your star to 1 or 2, employers, which is the case in this town. The other employer is an interesting one too, because it's a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate, which is much more at the whim of, globalization. And they really, really worry that, the day will come when this larger company will say, you know what, we can move this thing to Singapore and, either you take a 50% pay cut and, lose your benefits or we're gone, So, that's partly a response to it. I think that's an interesting story of, that not taking the money, but doing the right thing.
Is it a little shaky? I mean, it may be shaky to be depending on the conglomerate and the whims of globalization, but isn't it also a little shaky to be depending on the rectitude of an individual? And we had a man like that in Massachusetts who paid his workers after the Polartec fleece factory burned out, and he paid them while they rebuilt. Mm-hmm. And that it was a tremendous gesture. And
no,
there are people like that, but to depend on them, them being there when you need them, seems as risky as depending on the whims of globalization.
Oh no, absolutely, you're right. I mean, what it does is it underscores the precarious nature of many of these places that are, a downturn away from, what could be a devastating loss. And I think, but again, some of the things we talk about in terms of how do you rebuild, how do you retool, you're spreading your risk more widely. by sort of introducing new types of industry and so on.
So let's end on an upbeat note. Can you give us an example of a small town or community that has really turned it around and preserved its charm and its lifestyle and is making it?
You know, the good news is there are many places that have managed to do that. Let me give you two examples. One is the one I talked about a little bit earlier on, and that's Newton, Iowa. Newton's a larger town than the town that we did our research in, but one that was, KO'd really. It was really knocked down when Maytag, which employed 50-something% of the local workforce. It was just a staggering amount of people were dependent on that plant. When they closed, I mean, it really looked like this place was, the people were going to have to leave and they'd lose population and their tax base and so on. But they've really managed to, it's not completely turned around yet, but they're surviving better and close to thriving. That's one example. The other example I'm going to give is a town called Marquette in Kansas. It's in western Kansas. And Marquette was one of the first towns to do this free land program. And they had lost about 25% of their population in the sort of previous 10 years before and they offered these free land lots, which, for us living in sort of land-starved areas, it's like 4,500 square feet, that you would build a 4,500 square foot house basically, and then you'd have a homestead that would be like an acre and a half. As long as you broke ground within 18 months and committed to the town for at least 5 years. And so they gave you the free land, they offered water and sewer hookups. And I think Marquette was the town that also threw in a 3-year membership at the country club, which, hey, sweetener, a little cherry on top there. They managed to not only arrest their population decline, they actually grew by 200 people, which for a town of, I think, 700 and something people is massive, right? That's a massive influx. So, will this work long term? ? I don't know. But there are two places, I could give you dozens of others. I don't want to, go on ad nauseum, that, there is hope and it can happen.
Patrick Carr.
Thank you.